to see some familiar faces and some new faces also. My name is Pani Kendeu, and on behalf of the Learning Informatics Lab, I would like to welcome you to the first of a series of webinars this semester. This first one is featuring Dr. Simon Knight, and Bodong Shen will present our speaker in a second. The series this semester focuses on learning in the post-truth world. The term post-truth has been used to describe an epistemic climate where misinformation and opinion often takes precedence over evidence, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about that today. The Learning Informatics Lab was established in 2019 by the College of Education and Human Development in our university. It is an interdisciplinary intellectual space where we research, design, and mobilize information technology and data analytics to improve learning across the lifespan. So without further ado, I'm passing it over to Bodong to present our esteemed speaker for today.
Thanks for the introduction, Pani. This is Bodong Chen. I would like to again welcome you. Thanks for joining us in the cold winter weather. I know we're a bit better than last week, but the truth is we're trying to invite Simon to come over in the spring, which is summer for them in Sydney. So it didn't work out, but I'm happy that we're doing this webinar to learn about Simon's work. So it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Simon Knight, who is our guest speaker today. And Dr. Simon Knight is a senior lecturer at the University of Technology, Sydney, in a very interesting and new school called Transdisciplinary School. And he also funded and right now directs the Center for Research on Learning in a Technological Society. And he's also co-editor-in-chief of the pretty new Journal of Learning Analytics. As you can tell from Simon's bio, he brings together all kinds of exciting combination of expertise from psychology, philosophy, education, and technology to investigate a range of phenomena in learning and teaching. And his work focuses on how people think about evidence and use evidence to inform decisions in many different kinds of contexts, including search engines, including teachers making decisions using data in their classrooms. And his works has appeared in all kinds of venues, ranging from learning analytics, of course, education, communication, educational technology, and so on. So I'm really excited to have Simon to spend time with us and share about his work on this topic. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Simon, and go ahead and get us started. Thanks.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to speak, and to everybody who's coming along today. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing whilst I've been at UTS and before that, and sort of situate it, I hope, in a way that will connect with the learning informatics theme, which I'm really interested to talk about perhaps at the end, and there should be plenty of time for Q&A. If you're very familiar with epistemic cognition, then I apologize because I might gloss over some details. But the aim here is to try and give a bit of an overview of how these topics connect to that theme of post-truth. Some of the work I'm talking about is a little bit older, and some of it is work that we are currently developing, and so the results are a little bit fresher and a bit more preliminary, and I'll kind of flag that a little bit as we go through. And to kick off, I'm just going to start with two stories, and our protagonists in these two stories are a parent who's trying to understand information around things like childhood vaccinations, or perhaps somebody who's trying to lose weight and they're investigating the merits of particular diets versus regular food stuff or using supplements. And these kinds of information and these sorts of information problems should be fairly familiar in your professional and perhaps personal lives, and of course civic decision making as well. And what our protagonists are likely to do is go off and engage in some searching. And in one story, our protagonist might find a particular page and they might stay there. So they might just look at one individual source and gain as much information as they can from that one. Our other protagonist might do something different. They might actually try to explore multiple different sources. And you might have seen there was some work, it's now a couple of years old, from the Stanford History Education Group. And in that work, they looked at how novices and experts search for information and how they spot real news versus advertorial content. There's an irony because it was actually reported as students can't spot fake news, but the content that the students couldn't spot was advertorial content. So it's actually presented to look like real news, and it's about marketing things. So it's a little bit different from fake news. And in that news, they show, in that research, they showed that undergrads tended to read vertically. That is, they go to a page and they read down the page and sort of down the website. So they might look at things like the about page, look at who the author is, but they're staying within the individual. And that's a kind of evaluation as though these things were printed news stories. In contrast, people like fact checkers, and this mirrors what history experts do as well, is they engage in a strategy that group calls reading laterally. So they jump off the original page, actually very quickly, open up a new tab and Google for the name of the organization or the key people involved in that organization. So in the case of our protagonists, that might involve doing things like finding a WebMD the medical page, and rather than searching through that immediately, if you weren't familiar with the organization, going and researching whether or not they're credible first. The twist on this is that, unfortunately, some people actually uncritically navigate many pages, and of course, some single pages are indeed authoritative. And so one of the challenges that we face as researchers and as educators is how do we help people to corroborate and identify credibility when they're engaging in these sorts of search tasks. And one of the ways that different kinds of strategies have been characterized is by looking at these different sets of strategies. So we have the multiplists, whose view is that knowledge can be thought of in terms of many different perspectives. So there is perhaps not one single source of truth. On the other side, we've got the kind of uncritical and self-affirming adoption. So perhaps we're looking for things that affirm our prior belief. And then somewhere in the middle, we've got justification through expertise. So we're looking for single authoritative sources, or perhaps multiple, and then synthesize and evaluate. So we're looking at multiple sources still, but we're trying to work out who's the most credible in these sources and how do all of the claims fit together. It's a massive challenge when the claims that we see across different websites might conflict with each other. And so the area of epistemic cognition, oops, apologies, The area of epistemic cognition is really about looking at this issue and thinking about how, when we solve problems, it's not just about what we know, although content knowledge does matter. It's also about how we think about knowledge. And the most common way of characterizing epistemic cognition is in terms of this four-factor kind of model. So where we take epistemological beliefs to be a lens for a learner's views on what is to be learned. And epistemic cognition, how we think about knowledge, involves our views on the certainty of knowledge. So do we understand it as a sort of static, fixed entity, or do we understand that it's tentative and evolving? Think about the scientific process there. Do we understand that it's discrete? So individual facts are the things that matter, or see how different kinds of claims fit together into holistic webs of knowledge? Where do we look for the source of knowledge? Do we try and look for external sources, or do we think it's about kind of self-construction? And then how do we justify our knowledge claims? And this is perhaps the most crucial one and the one that people are very familiar with. So are we looking for authorities, but not necessarily looking at why they might be authorities, through to looking at evaluation of the processes and methods that we have for reliable belief formation, so evaluation of knowledge. And we can broadly kind of fit those models that I was talking about before under these kind of views. So absolutists, people who hold that knowledge is kind of more fixed, more likely perhaps to look uncritically at sources and look for individual authorities. Evaluativists are likely to look at multiple sources and the justification for them. And then multiplists will look at multiple sources perhaps, but may not be able to integrate those claims. And these are kind of two different models of epistemic cognition that provide useful lenses onto this sort of challenge. So to put that in some fairly concrete terms, these I think are two really nice examples. So people who think that science is about absolute truth find that uncertain claims, so things like 97% of scientists, are less convincing, whereas those who understand that science is tentative and evolving find such claims more convincing. And people who think that corroboration and expertise are important for justification are more likely to consult multiple sources when they're trying to come to some decision. And Bratton et al. This is a team in Oslo, led by Eva Bratton and I've forgotten his Elga Stromso, have done a lot of research around how people engage in multiple source processing and the role of epistemic cognition in that. And in these sorts of tasks, what we're doing is creating often lab-based tasks where we give learners a set of sources, and the sources differ in some important ways, perhaps including content and credibility features. And then we investigate how they come to decisions based off of these sources, the views that they hold, having engaged with them, and how they try to integrate claims if they do at all. And so using that model that I described earlier, in 2011, they put forward this nice sort of simplification of the kinds of prototypical behaviors that we might see. So less adaptive behaviors, we might just see preferences for simple sources, accumulation of facts, emphasis of their own opinion, and differentiation between different kinds of sources being less, and an emphasis on authority over corroboration. More adaptive approaches would look to try and integrate claims from across multiple sources and to downplay simple sources to corroborate and distinguish between sources of different levels of trustworthiness, particularly using things like argumentation schema, looking at the methods that have been used to come to the claims across those different sources. In some more recent work, there's also been, and this is one of the kind of preliminary pieces of this talk, there's also been a turn to consider some of the ethical dimensions in this sort of multiple source task. And I characterized this at last year's ICLS conference in terms of looking at epistemic stakes. So when we think about knowledge claims, we care about certain kinds of knowledge claims more than others because they have stakes. So climate change is a really obvious one where, of course, the impacts will be felt unequally, and the impacts regardless will be enormous on the whole of humanity. We care about problems like that more than, for example, which sandwich shop I should go to for lunch, although both of those have epistemic features involved in them. That matters both in terms of course, when we're researchers, we design tasks around the high epistemic stakes contexts, but it's also interesting to think about whether or not people have individual views about some of those problems as well. Perhaps there are people who think that the sandwich shop case is higher epistemic stakes than I do. It's unlikely. We also look at things like epistemic injustice. So good knowers should have obligations to be curious and seek reliable belief forming mechanisms. That's a sort of epistemological claim. In terms of epistemic cognition, we're also interested in what are people's beliefs about that kind of claim. So what beliefs do people have about the epistemic obligations of themselves and others? And then the final one, and this is sort of the crucial one for this, is epistemic injustice. So people's beliefs and practices around the inclusion and exclusion of voices matters both in terms of the injustices that it perpetuates. So, for example, whether or not women's voices are included or excluded in particular discourse, and in terms of the obligations and the implications for those reliable belief forming mechanisms. So Randy Zimmerman and Clark Chin at Rutgers have been doing work around this as well. And if this is an area you're interested in, I'm definitely happy to talk to you, but I'm also very aware Randy's done some really fantastic work as part of her PhD, which she's just possibly submitted now, but anyway, is finishing up. And there should be more work coming out from that lab. So I would keep an eye out for that. It's exciting and I think really important work. And then, of course, the other reason that these stories matter is just that it's very easy to find examples where people are, in fact, exposed to conflicting information on particular topics. So these are some now slightly older examples. The one on the right-hand side really annoyed me because AHM is a health insurance fund in Australia. And the text on this reads, "Health is confusing enough." And on the left-hand side, there's a mocked up newspaper page that says broccoli, new superfood. And on the right-hand side, broccoli linked to cancer, today, tomorrow. And and did that thing you shouldn't really bother doing and tried to tweet them to get them to reflect on whether this was a good idea. They didn't engage. And this was particularly annoying because they're a health insurance fund and there is obviously, there is no conflict over this topic. So I'm slightly baffled why they would use it as an example, potentially creating further mistrust of science and of health funds more broadly. In other contexts, so the one on the bottom left, do we need conclusive scientific proof to become concerned about an issue, is an example of a pesticide Roundup, which has continued to be controversial. I think scientific views on that have also changed over time. And then the one on the top left, the Daily Mail does know how to write a headline, is about red yeast rice, which does have a medical impact of the same kind as statins, and discussing the kind of safety of taking red yeast rice as an alternative to statins and so on. However, in research around this kind of topic, the ways things get set up are sometimes a bit different. Now, what people need to be able to do to navigate those sorts of claims is reflect on, engage with the texts, increasingly multimodal as well. So we're seeing a lot more video. Things like Instagram posts are increasingly influential in terms of shaping people's beliefs. And there's relatively little research on that to come to some sort of decision. So the protagonists we used earlier, looking at vaccinating their child or losing weight. To do that, they need to be able to evaluate sources, the examples above, plus doing their own research perhaps, and attempting to corroborate and integrate claims. Unfortunately, when we do research on this, not unfortunately, sorry, that's unfair. There has been a lot of very important research on these kinds of topics that's looked at cases where we're providing learners with things like a textbook excerpt, journalistic content from perhaps a not very reputable outlet or newspaper, perhaps a blog by a non-expert as well, and so on, alongside higher quality things. So textbooks, which tend to present the sort of static view of knowledge sometimes, along with perhaps expert summaries of the evidence, and then exploring how people navigate that kind of information. One of the things that I'm really interested in at the moment, and again, this is emerging work, is how people process expert disagreement. So the case of the health funds that I gave above is kind of playing on this idea that, oh, the experts don't know what they're talking about. And you hear these kinds of things fairly frequently, but it's relatively little explored in the epistemic cognition literature, I think. And my hunch would be, and I think we could probably set up experimental studies to explore this, that a poor understanding of expert disagreement might make people more susceptible then to misinformation. And one piece of evidence towards that kind of claim comes from some researchers in nutrition who found that, sorry, just let me find my notes. People do encounter conflicting nutrition advice fairly frequently. they're not sure how to navigate it, and that this confusion can actually lead to a distrust, not only in the target topic, but also in wider nutrition topics and expert advice on that. So that research from Nagler et al., they've actually done some recent research also looking at advice around COVID and people's exposure to COVID conflicting evidence. And there's some evidence that this might also be true of other groups. So for example, science students, when they look for certainty in scientific results, they tend to reject the sort of tentativeness of science and think that that's a good model for what science is trying to do. And people tend to explain these differences in terms of methodological differences and, crucially, competence and motivation of the researchers. So, for example, looking at the funder for the research, which is certainly an important feature, and looking at just the competence of the researcher, or just assuming that some of the researchers were incompetent. This is a problem because what we want them to be doing is thinking more about corroboration across multiple sources. So not just looking at what the latest study says, but fitting that into the wider body of work, complex justification, and then thinking about, well, the uncertainty and tentativeness of evidence over time. Bodong suggested that I included some Trump memes, and it was just too depressing. But it is very easy, again, to continue to find examples of these kinds of problems over the last year with COVID. These articles are a bit older, but in March of last year, and it's hard to kind of remember this in some ways, the scientific consensus on wearing face masks was genuinely unclear. Partly that was about the supply of face masks and how we should prioritize purchasing of them. But it wasn't just about that. And it took until the end of April in the US for the president to be calling for masks to be worn while saying that he wouldn't wear one, and elsewhere around the world as well. Actually, in Australia, we've had very, very low cases, but Sydney, at least, has only had face mask mandate on public transport for a month, I think it is now, as a result of an outbreak back around a month or 6 weeks ago, whenever it was. One of the things that I've been doing over the last 6 months or so, thinking about how we might help to understand how people are navigating COVID, is thinking about developing studies around how people navigate these sorts of conflict. And the Media Cloud tool, which is an MIT tool, is quite useful for this, and I think fits into the sort of learning informatics suite. Because what it does is let you put keywords and it will search subsets of written media that you provided. So I've specifically narrowed in on Australian print media, web print that is, and looking for articles that just focus on the words, things like scientists disagree, scientific disagreement, and so on, to look at the kind of themes that are coming up there and what sorts of topics people might be encountering as they browse the web, but also just as they encounter news media, either directly or before Facebook removed all the news via social media websites. And the other thing that we've been doing is, and this is work with my colleague and PhD candidate, Christine Deruva, is trying to develop a taxonomy through review of the literature and interviews with experts regarding how we can characterize expert-expert disagreement. So I said before that competence and motivation were key features that lay people tend to focus on when they're thinking about why experts disagree. Slightly to my surprise, looking at a range of sort of philosophy of science, previous research in the learning sciences and psychology and communications, there has not been very much work on actually how do we characterize these kinds of disagreements, what sorts of things are people exposed to. And so that's what Christine's been doing. We had a preliminary publication, her background's nutrition, and we've just got a full article in submission at the moment, so fingers crossed we'll have some positive reviews on that. But the kind of range of things that we're looking at there includes, of course, evidence quality and what evidence is available, as well as things like how we operationalize what things are going into our model and what dependent variables we're looking for. So that's input and output ambiguities. The role of just human judgment, which includes things like, appetite for risk. So if you look at things like the safety of alcohol consumption, we can do all the science that we like on that, and people do need to be able to navigate other features of disagreement here. But a component of disagreement around topics like that is simply about what people's appetite for risk is and what level of acceptable risks they're prepared to tolerate. And actually explaining those features, I think, is really important, alongside things like tentativeness of knowledge, inherent uncertainty of science, and sort of probabilistic things and so on. So this is a fairly preliminary thing, but more work will be coming out. And what we're hoping is that resources like this will help to, not necessarily directly with learners and students, but may help people who engage in things, public communication of science, health literacy, to develop resources to help people to navigate these kinds of topics. So that kind of fits into the other sorts of strategies that we can adopt. And this is from work on the top left that I conducted a few years ago now. And on the top right, Barzilai and Kadan, looking at how we can help people to think better about the evidence that they're encountering, about the credibility of it, and integrating those claims. And happily, simple interventions can help. So if we ask people just how they would confirm their knowledge, that encourages better source engagement and evaluation. And then simple strategic scaffolds can help as well. So in both of the images here, the kinds of features that we were looking for was asking students to think about who wrote it, what was their expertise to write it, and their interests. So that's that motivation and competence question again. When was it published? So recency may matter, alongside what they said and the evidence that they put forward for the claims as well. And doing that with multiple different sources to think about how these things conflict, so what claims conflict, and how to integrate. In my work there and subsequent work as well, we also looked at the communication that students engaged in. So we actually asked people to do these kinds of tasks in pairs or trios, which was an unusual approach to take. And this was on the basis that communication, and particularly what Goldman and Scardamelia call meta-discourse, which involves discussion of things like the credentials of the sources and so on, is really key to collectively authoring pieces. So we were asking people to come to some sort of conclusion or make a recommendation based on what they were reading. And the work was really recognizing that cognition is discursive, and we wrote a paper for Educational Research Review off the back of it, describing what we call a socialized perspective of epistemic cognition that talked about these sorts of discursive properties and how we might see that in collaborative work rather than running these tasks as individual. Of course, that introduces a lot of complexity as well. So in the first one of these studies, we asked 11-year-olds to engage in an assigned task on role models. And this was in one of their regular teaching sessions. So they had closed questions, things like how many women have won the Nobel Prize, and then more open questions. So why do some people think Nelson Mandela is a good role model, for example? And they were asked to justify their choices and state the sources. And then we looked at what they were doing. We screen recorded as well and looked at how they were talking to each other about what they were finding and the quality of the sources that they were engaging with. And this was a fairly small study. We only had 3 groups. And what we found was one of the groups was quite successful, and they were characterized by saying things like, it's got all of the important information and it's a good site. So they focused on quality and to some extent complexity of the sources as well. Another group really focused on novelty. So they used the phrase in their dialogue, "I didn't know that," a lot. And they were really explicitly looking for authoritative sources. So they noted the quality of like the BBC material that they encountered. And talked about things like Yahoo Answers being perhaps a little bit more problematic. But they were very focused on extracting really direct answers to the questions. So they were looking for simple answers to both the open and the closed questions. And then the last group really focused on just the amount of information. So they looked at multiple different kinds of sources, but they treated all of them the same. So Yahoo Answers was put on the same kind of epistemic footing as the official Nobel Prize website, for example. In some subsequent work, I collaborated with Rutgers University and Chirag Shah there. He's now at Washington, I think. That group had developed a tool called Coagmento. And again, this is kind of interesting in terms of, the intersection of technology and information. And Coagmento has built-in functions for chats. It foregrounds the searches that people are making. So it's a browser add-on and it records those things. It has an Etherpad connection. So Etherpads are similar to Google Docs, if you don't know them, but it's open source. And it tracks people's page views and their copy-paste behaviors. So we can actually look at how are people extracting information from the pages, what are they talking about when they're on particular sources, and so on. And these are just some more screenshots. And in that work, we did 2 things, and I'm just going to focus on the simpler one. With one group, we actually gave them a topic and we asked them to search the web. In the other group, we gave them a more classic multiple source processing task where we'd mapped out different subtopics. So that's the 3 on the left-hand side here. And this was about a pesticide, Roundup, in fact. And then different texts which had different qualities and how they intersected. And what we were interested in was whether or not people would draw on these different topics when they were writing a recommendation. In this case, it wasn't a recommendation to a friend, it was to a minister that was looking at renewing the license. How they'd draw on the sources, the kinds of talk they'd engage in around the credibility of those sources, and which topics they'd include. And some previous research has described 3 kinds of responses that you get when you ask students to do these sorts of tasks. So you get satisficers who select very few sources. They're just looking for responses from one. Selectors who might select various sources but perhaps not connect them. So you'd see things like bullet pointing, and even if bullet point 1 directly contradicted bullet point 2, that would be as far as they go. There'd be no synthesis there. And then synthesizers who actually engage in looking at how the different sources fit together, how the claims in the sources fit together, and trying to evaluate those. And we also looked at what they were talking about, and the sort of headlines that the only headline I'm going to focus on in this talk is just, we could see that there were different kinds of responses from the students. So there were students who engaged in all 3 of those behaviors. We could characterize satisficers, selectors, and synthesizers. And when we looked at the dialogue as well, you could see that students were trying to explain their reasoning. So that's what these E's are, things like I think, because, and so on. They talked about the quality of sources. So we were looking for references to the sources and to sort of generic words, so things like the source, the site, and so on. And we could see differences in how people were doing that as well. Obviously, they engaged in talk about the different kinds of topics that they were encountering. And then they were building up how they were going to synthesize all of this into the text as well. So the point here is we can use these kinds of tasks to get insights into the sorts of behaviors that students engage in and use that as a way to support that behavior. So the need to navigate different sources, disagreement across those sources, and uncertainty is really ever present. And there's a range of different evidence that suggests that we need to encourage people to consider their evidence and its quality against the particular claims that are being asserted both by them and in the sources they're looking at. Engaging people in identifying others and constructing their own arguments is important, and looking at multiple perspectives and the evidence that they're founded on. And that doesn't mean being neutral about the different perspectives that we see. It's about explaining what the different sides show, and actually refutation of some of those perspectives can be useful to help learning as well. And these are the sort of top tips from the Handbook of Epistemic Cognition that was released 2 or 3 years ago now. And so in more detail, there's previous evidence that shows exposure to conflicts can help learning, that actually looking at topics people might not be familiar with may be helpful. So often the focus of this kind of work is on things like climate change. Of course, that's really important per epistemic stakes. The problem with doing that is people have prior beliefs. And so looking at things like red yeast rice was an example I used, can be helpful because it's less likely that people have prior beliefs on those topics, and that can help people learn these skills, which hopefully then they will also apply to the topics that they have prior beliefs on. And we've looked at, asking people to explain the evidence, getting people to create a recommendation from multiple sources rather than just a basic summary, and so on. The other thing I want to just flag really briefly is that teachers' beliefs also matter in this. So how teachers think about knowledge and knowing can shape their learning design, so how they develop these kinds of tasks. And we have a proposal around that topic, and also their assessment practices. So whether they are looking for sort of fixed statements of knowledge from their students, how they design the kinds of tasks they run, and so on. The really key thing is that presentation of science for students and for wider learners reflects then how those people understand it. So if we present science in a really simplified way, then that is how people understand it. So we need to be able to explain evidentiary standards and to tackle false balance to help people to navigate, uncertainty, those ambiguities I was talking about earlier, and so on. And so we need policies that help to support students and educators preparing for that, and to unpack the evidence, present the sides, and so on. So the aim here is to shift from do they understand the science and evidence more broadly to do they understand evidence and how evidence connects to claims. And we're looking, the indicators in our learning will be around improved synthesis. So if we give people different sources, people try to integrate them, better dialogue, argumentation, and perspective taking. And then I was thinking when I was writing this about how this all connects to learning informatics, and I'd be interested in hearing other people's thoughts on this as well. Where we're looking at information processes, so information seeking, integration of multiple sources. The artifacts and data that we engage in are algorithmically mediated access to media, both multimedia, which is relatively less understood, and text media. And we need to be able to use those across various different kinds of decision-making processes. The examples I've given are a sort of dummy making a recommendation, but the protagonists I talked about at the start, of course, they are actually engaging in these processes, on vaccination, weight loss, and so on. And so we need to understand how to characterize these processes to understand and support learning in those kinds of situations. Okay, I'm gonna leave it there. I have a long list of acknowledgements of colleagues that I've worked in across different contexts for this work. And I'm very happy to take questions and discuss further. I'm also just going to turn my fan on because it's got a bit warm.
Thank you, Simon, so much for the presentation. There's so many insightful ideas and very important information as well. So let's just open the floor and then jump into Q&A. We have around like 10 minutes to further discuss ideas in this talk. I see already there's a hand up. So for those who are interested in asking a question directly to Simon, feel free to turn on your mic or video if you wish to, and then just speak up. I'm pretty sure I saw a hand up. Maybe let me see. Or maybe that was testing the technology. But any question, feel free to jump in, or you can paste your question to the link. That will work as well.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Pani.
Simon, I've been thinking about this quite a bit lately with everything that is going on with COVID and vaccinations and so on. I mean, this idea of epistemic performance, or being able to do all of the things like you have been examining, right? Find the credible sources and understand the experts, or identify who's an expert and who is not. How realistic is it asking people to do all of this? Or is there an alternative way or a complementary way that maybe through technology or learning analytics, we could facilitate a lot of that, given that what we are really asking is actually a lot, and especially for topics that we don't know anything about, right? So I'm curious about your thoughts about that. It's something that I struggle with a lot in terms of thinking, okay, is this even feasible to ask people to do all of this, to check the sources, to validate the sources, to understand who's an expert and whatnot?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great question, and I think it's a real, I think it's a balancing act. I think one of the things that has been sort of under-recognized in some areas of sort of the learning sciences discourse is the role of testimonial knowledge. So we come to know things because people tell us those things. And sometimes we focus on direct experience, through experimentation. And it's interesting, you see in misinformation merchants, people making the claim, well, have you done the research? I did my own research. And so clearly just teaching people how to engage with processes of, searching for conflicting views, for example, is not going to be enough. In fact, it might be harmful. I think there are multiple different responses to that. One is the kinds of things I'm talking about that we need to teach people. So helping people to understand what an authoritative source looks like, to understand why educators have particular kinds of expertise, scientists have particular kinds of expertise. But the crucial claim in what I'm saying is part of that has to be about those people not just simplifying the sorts of claims that they're making, but actually expressing how they've come to those views and why views have changed as well. So the face masks case is a nice one where I think we need a clear explanation for people to understand how is it that we get these policy changes or these perspective changes from experts. Another part is policy and regulation. The advertorial content that I talked about at the start, the reason that is a problem is because of a failure of policy. And I don't think that government should abdicate their responsibility to citizens through things like reliance on nudge, or even reliance on schooling, where there are very clear-cut policies that you could introduce that would reduce the nature of that problem. So in that case, maybe having advertorial content that looks exactly the same as media content is just a bad idea. And so I think that has to be part of the story as well. And then I think you're right too, that technology can play a role. There's different ways that might look. So exploring things like trustworthiness indicators, on particular platforms, how we present fact checks to people. We've got a project, again, this is a proposal at the moment, where we're looking at whether we can support the mobilization of fact checks. So fact checks get shared by social media companies automatically on some kinds of claims, but we're interested in how we can support lay people, so social media users, to make use of fact checks in their sort of natural discourse. Part of that's about education, but it's also about designing technologies that foster that and evaluating those behaviors too.
I have a quick question. Thank you for the presentation. I was jotting down new terms. I'm pretty new to this area, but it's really interesting to me. And in particular, I like how you mentioned a couple of times that maybe some of our work in this space needs to be around helping people understand what is valid science, or like true science or something. You probably said it much more elegantly than I am, but what science is and what's true. And then you also mentioned this idea of epistemic injustice, and both of those things made me wonder whether or not there's some sort of cultural responsive approach that this field is taking, so that they're broadening what counts as science. So it's not just here are the facts and here's who's doing it, but like, how do these different cultures or these different contexts create science?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So on there's like a body of work that falls under the banner of the nature of science. That's the sort of concept that's often used. And a friend of mine who did a PhD at University of New South Wales in Sydney did some nice studies. And my memory is that she showed that public science events, if you asked people, if you gave people some of these nature of science instruments pre-post, that public science events had a negative impact on people's understanding of the nature of science. And I think that's because, you know, if you talk to media people at universities, we're told, oh no, don't put the hedging in. We need like the clear statement of what you found. And then the science kind of gets hidden away sometimes. So that's kind of where the issue is there. And I think this is an area that I'm not qualified to speak on, but I know that there are people not in the epistemic cognition literature, to the best of my knowledge, but looking at indigenous knowledges, for example. It's a big, it's an area that people are actively looking at in Australia and thinking about how that is integrated into science teaching. And I think it's interesting how the sort of metaphors that we use to explain science to people in schools and outside, we don't reflect how they're culturally not bound, but grounded, I guess, and how why it might be important for us to look at how different cultures have come to these understandings. And I think you're right that there would be benefits to doing that and to understanding how people think about that as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. We're approaching the end of this webinar. I know there might be more questions in the audience, and I trust you have the contact information of Simon. Then you can arrange a further conversation with Simon. But I want to take this chance to thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Simon, especially for sharing your work with us. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bodong, and thanks everyone for attending and for the invitation. And yeah, I'm happy to talk to people if you want to drop me an email or a tweet.
All right. Thanks. Take care.